its flow, and this is my impression of a beat poet. Name your price. A tool, an idea, an inspiration to do more than just say what you want to pay. Oh no, but to see the options that could fit your budget. Steve, enough bongos.
Find car insurance that fits your budget at Progressive.com.
Makes me want to dance. Steve!
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Blog Talk Radio.
It's Thursday, May 3rd, 2012. This is the Hermetic Hour with your host, Poke Runyon, and tonight we present a discussion on one of the most influential books in the modern revival of paganism, witchcraft, and magic. This is the 1948 The White Goddess by Poet Laureate Robert Graves. This book is difficult to read even for those well-versed in myth, lore, and classical literature. Graves takes a poet's magical and even whimsical approach to what at first appears to be anthropology, even though he warns the reader that he's not dealing with history as it was, but rather as the ancient and medieval bards imagined it to have been, which is just as important as how it really was. And his argument is that behind all true poetry lies the inspiration of a haunting primordial muse, the prehistoric moon goddess of birth, youth, and death, and the phases of nature. He is a cultural diffusionist, spinning off from Fraser on a wild ride from ancient Greece to the Druids, tying together the whole warp and woof of Western esoteric lore from the Bible to the troubadours. The White Goddess had a major influence on Fred Adams and Svetlana's Peripheria, with the tree alphabet being a central element in Periferian structure. The book was also a very strong influence on Roy Bauer's Order of 1734 and the subsequent Roebuck of the Finnans. And it has also had some influence on the OTA and many other pagan and magical groups. So, tune in and plumb the mysteries of the Druid's Handbook and the Thinking Witch's Bible. Well, we're going to have a very, very distinguished guest tonight who really knows this subject quite well, and that's Jo Carson, the Avitrix of Periferia. And she's going to be calling in about 10 or 15 minutes, so I want to get the introduction to this off right quick, so when Jo and I could get going, we'll at least have you introduced to it. Now, you go to Wikipedia, they have a nice write-up on the White Goddess in Wikipedia, and it starts off, says, The White Goddess, a historical grammar of poetic myth, is a book-length essay on the nature of poetic myth-making by author and poet Robert Graves, first published in 1948, based on earlier articles published in Wales Magazine, corrected, revised, and enlarged editions, appeared in 1948, 1952, and 1961. The White Goddess represents an approach to the study of mythology from a decidedly creative and idiosyncratic perspective. Graves proposes the existence of a European deity, the white goddess of birth, love, and death, much similar to the mother goddess, inspired and represented by the phases of the moon, who lies behind the faces of the diverse goddesses of various European and pagan mythologies. Graves argues that true or pure poetry, it is inexorably linked with the ancient cult ritual of this proposed white goddess and her son. Now, the history of this book is Graves first wrote the book under the title The Roebuck in the Thicket in a 3-week period during January 1944, only a month after finishing The Golden Fleece, which was a historical novel on Hercules. He then took the book to focus, he then left the book to focus on King Jesus, a historical novel about the life of Jesus. And then he returned to The Roebuck in the Thicket, and he renamed it The Threefold Muse after finishing it, and retitled it as The White Goddess. Now, in January 1946, he sent it to his publishers, and in May 1948, it was published in the UK, and June 1948 in the US as The White Goddess, an Historical Grammar of Myth. Now, you can imagine that this came out right about the time that witchcraft was stirring right after World War II in Britain, because they had finally repealed the anti-witchcraft laws that were still on the books, and so and all of the dynamic of post-war Britain, the disenfranchising of the aristocracy, and the advent of socialism, and all of the depressed economy after World War II, all of this had to do with this kind of social rebellion that was stirring. They wanted in a sense, they wanted a revival to something earlier, before the Christianity and what have you. So this was the rebirth of the witchcraft movement as they were reconstructing it. And Graves' White Goddess, along with Gerald Gardner's High Magic's Aid and Witchcraft Today, these books all came out around about this time. And Gerald Gardner's Gardnerian Witchcraft, I don't think that the White Goddess had that much influence on Gardnerian witchcraft when it got started. It didn't. It did later, but I mean, when Gardnerian witchcraft got started, it was primarily Gerald Gardner and Aleister Crowley. They put it together, but the White Goddess was Celtic. It was oriented toward the Celtic, and when I said in the abstract that it was the Druid's Handbook, it in a way it is, because Druidism, as most of you know, was literally wiped out by the Romans back at the time of Christ. The Romans actually before Christ, the Romans were bound and determined that they were going to exterminate Druidism both in France and in Britain, and it survived a little bit longer in Ireland. But Druidism was the religion of the Celtic tribes, the forest people, and in the great oak forest that stretched all the way from Poland to the western coast of Ireland. And the Druids were the priests and the wise men and the astrologers and the rune masters of this Celtic civilization, and which finally centered itself. It got pushed all the way into Wales and then into Ireland, and that's where the Romans finally concentrated in about 55 BC, and they pushed all the Druids back into Wales, and then finally to an island off the coast of Wales, and then they exterminated them. And the Romans went on just a rampage to destroy every bit of trace of Druidic lore. Now, the Druids the Druids had a very sophisticated system, and they had a very sophisticated magical system and lore, but they didn't like to write anything down. They liked to memorize everything, and they liked to put it in the form of poetry, mystical poetry. And just kind of like Masonry today, you know, Masons memorize all their ritual, but they did have a form of writing. It was called ogham, and so they did have some books, and the Romans destroyed them. They were afraid of Druidism, and they went on a campaign to steal. So hardly anything is really known. Later on, when in Victorian times, you know, when they tried to resurrect Druidism, nobody really knew what it was all about. We had to, and the only way it could really be interpreted was from this poetry, this Welsh poetry and Irish poetry that had been written down in Christian times, and so it had all kinds of Christian overlay because the monks were writing it down, the early legends and all this, but they were naturally distorting it to make it acceptable to a Christian abbot or, you know, in a Christian government, and so it was corrupted in this way. Now, the King Arthur legends were certainly an example of this, and they finally got transposed into the late medieval period, and we have this early Celtic hero, possibly even pre-Christian, becoming transliterated into a Norman French king who has a circle of knights, and then you have this whole Holy Grail. And all this is tremendous cultural infusions and distortion going on here. So Graves, as a poet, he is using his poetic inspiration to go through all these old manuscripts and try to intuit, almost by going into trance, and intuit what it is that these really mean. What are the ancient meanings of these later Christian writings about the early mythology? That's how he constructed the White Goddess, and he had a theory. You know, whether it's true or not, I'm not going to say, but he had a theory that behind all of this lay this primordial moon goddess, this white goddess of going back almost to prehistoric times, and that it was, the stories were really about her son, and her son he equates with Hercules or Heracles. And he's spinning off here from Sir James Frazer, The Golden Bough, as a monumental anthropological treatise that ran to 12 volumes finally. Frazer started it in 1890, and he finally finished it around 1922. But The Golden Bough was a tremendous treatise on the dying and resurrected God, and the year king, that you find in so many witchcraft traditions. We have it in the OTA, and the Joe, are you out there yet? And anyway, the Frazer's Golden Bough is the source, the original source for the White Goddess. This is and so what Graves is suggesting is that Hercules, who is a dying god, and he's a hero, you know, like Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell was about to Fraser too, of course, and that this dying god, this year king, is the son of the goddess, and the goddess is eternal, and so you find in the White Goddess, you find a continual focus on the adventures of this continual reincarnation of Hercules and the labors. Now, you realize, of course, that and Graves, of course, leads you into this step by step, that Hercules has the 12 labors. Well, what are the 12 labors? Obviously, they relate to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so the whole Hercules myth and the myth of the Year King is celestial. It's zodiacal. And so and this also relates to the seasons of nature. So what Graves does is he creates, after he deciphers this poem, and after he goes through several recensions of deciphering this, the Battle of the Trees and Song of the Virgin and all this, and I think we have Joe Carson. Joe, are you there?
Yeah, hi, Poke. I'm here. How are you?
Yeah. Oh well, I'm doing pretty good, but I'm just about ready to let you take over for a little bit. By the way, before we get started, I read that critique that you sent me, and I also read the critique in Wikipedia. So I just laid out what. Now a capsule view of the White Goddess. So you want to take and give us your take on it?
Yeah, I think that what you said makes a lot of sense. I love the way of looking at it as being, throw down the gauntlet as a poet. Like I can create this, this vision and put it out there, and people then react to it, and it becomes a thing of itself. Like it becomes a mythology which has started in relatively modern times. By describing it as the way things should have been, could have been, in a poetic way really were, even though they don't fit with historical facts, it's fine because it gives us something more than what we had without it. And it's beautiful. It really is beautiful as concepts go. However, I have to admit I'm not really with this whole diffusionist thing, the idea that somehow everything is related to everything, and especially, kind of relating it all to these Roman and Greek gods. I think really, it takes away from the cultural validity of what was going on in the British Isles and in the Celtic countries. They weren't really, in other words, they created so much of beauty that was really their own. It doesn't have to be Greek to be valid. You see what I'm saying?
Oh, yeah, and I agree with you. And I pointed out when I first got started here that Graves was a cultural diffusionist. And this business of cultural diffusionism was popular back in the 19th century. It got started by a writer named I forget his name right off the head, but he started this cultural diffusionist thing. He said everything. He was really enamored of ancient Egypt, and this was after the Rosetta Stone was deciphered. And he said, "Oh, everything comes from ancient Egypt." And he went on to on and on. Elliot Smith, that's it. He went on and on and on, trying to trace everything back to ancient Egypt. And this was the start of cultural diffusionism. Well, some people, of course, then some people tried to relate everything back to Atlantis. Of course, they didn't really know that much about Atlantis except from Plato. And so cultural diffusionism got to be a really going thing for years, all the way up to just about the time Jesse Weston wrote From Ritual to Romance, which I was going to mention, and which became, by the way, a template. Jesse Weston's Ritual to Romance, 1920. That was a template for the White Goddess, and Graves used her whole approach when he did the White Goddess, and the way it worked was that you felt like that all of this got started somewhere, and then each culture that it went to did their version of it, and changed the names to suit their own. But some of this actually, it becomes such a ball of wax when you get into it that diffusionism it just literally had to die a death because they were going too far with it.
It went too far, yeah.
Way too far. Elliot Smith went way too far, and Max Mueller, of course, with this solar myth thing. He came out before the Golden Bough. Good Lord, everything was a solar myth. Everything. Didn't matter. Odin was a solar, and we all know Odin wasn't a solar god, but according to Max Mueller, everything was solar, and they carried this diffusionism and these little pet theories way too far. The Ritual to Romance. Ritual to Romance is a reason why I am mentioning this. Besides the fact that it was a template for the White Goddess, was because the Ritual to Romance is for the OTA like the White Goddess is for Feraferia in 1734. And yeah, Ritual to Romance is Jesse Weston and tracing the Holy Grail legend all the way back through the troubadours, all the way back to ancient Canaan and the death of Baal, and she traces it all the way back, and by analogy and by whatever. And Graves did the same thing. Now, you want to talk a little bit about how we believe Graves influenced Fred?
Well, probably the most, up front and center thing, of course, is the concept of being oriented towards the goddess. Clearly, yes.
Yeah.
Feraferia is very much around the goddess. We're into that,
Yeah,
but,
right.
But also, really importantly, is that Graves brought out all the connections between the times of the year of the calendar as being sacred, from identifying, and this is where it's kind of fun when you just I take it more as kind of fun. It's like he was saying that the ancient Hebrew tradition, they had the secret name of God, and nobody could actually utter it, and various theories were presented, some of which he, gave good reasons for why they would be, have been the name that was actually used, including the idea that the secret name of God was an amalgam of the sacred names of the deities of each day of the week.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this long name consisting of 7, subparts, one for each day. And that, is another way that a person has, intuited, and it may very well be actually true at some point that it was referred to that way, that the days of the week, like the days of the month and the months of the year, all have a sacredness. And what Fred Adams has done, and he got so much of this, from the White Goddess, is this approach that there would be a wheel, a circular formation that would be the visual graph of the year. It would be the times of the calendar would be laid down on the wheel, and then the directions of, the 4 directions, and the 8, including the cross-quarter directions, and the elements, and that it would sort of tie everything together, that it would have all these layers of elements that would have correspondences, and that then within understanding where we are on the sacred year in terms of the time, like right now, obviously, we're at Beltane, okay, that gives you a way of relating to what the goddess herself is doing. And the goddess within Feraferia is seen as being the eternal goddess whose celestial throne is the moon, and who lives as a great goddess on earth. And the sun, or her son, is, dying and being reborn. We don't actually see the sun, this is a parenthesis, as being actually dying. After growing up with her and impregnating her at the midsummer, when they become married, she goes into the caves, and around the time as the seeds are going into the ground, he joins her in the caves voluntarily and sleeps with her, and then merges with her so that his soul becomes the new soul of the soon-to-be reborn your king. So it's not a violent mythos, in which I resonate with that a lot. I like that it's not violent. And
yeah, the Graves of course doesn't go. He's got the violent death of the Year King sort of thing that he got from Fraser, and he perpetuates that. But Fred and Svetlana, their concept was much gentler, and it was the maiden savioress and all. Whereas, one thing about the White Goddess, though, that I was mentioning the other day with you when we were kind of getting our thoughts together for this. Curiously enough, as much of an ardent feminist, at least in his own way, Graves was, he was adoring the mystery and the glamour of women, which some feminists probably would think is not really true feminism, but that was. But what Graves was actually doing here, though, is all the poetry that he's deciphering. This is all not about the goddess, but it's about her son. Mm-hmm. Her male son. There's almost nothing in the White Goddess. Here he's saying she is the muse of true poetry, and he's going on and on and on about this. But maybe it's just because poets, in the ancient days and in the medieval period, the bards were all male. So maybe that's the reason. But you would think that somewhere in there'd be a poem about women. I mean, and yet I suppose that's just so. But Graves is. There is a little section in here, and I think if I can find it, I kind of dug. I wrote it down here. Graves' description of feminism, and see if I can find it here. Oh yeah, I think I got it right about right. Let's see. Yeah. Well, this. This is the theme of the book, where he finally gets the theme of the book across. This is on page 24 of the enlarged edition. The theme, briefly, is an antique story which falls into 13 chapters and an epilogue of the birth, life, death, and resurrection of the god of the waxing year. The central chapters concern the god's losing battle with the god of the waning year for love of the capricious and all-powerful threefold goddess, their mother, bride, and layer out. Mm-hmm. The poet identifies himself with the god of the waxing year and his muse with the goddess, and the rival is his blood brother and his other self, his weird. All true poetry, true by Hausmann's practical test, celebrates some incident or scene of this very ancient story, and the three main characters are so much a part of our racial inheritance that they not only assert themselves in poetry, but recur on occasions of emotional stress in the form of dreams, paranoid visions, and delusions. The weird or rival often appears in the nightmare as the tall, lean, dark-faced bedside specter or prince of the air. And the goddess is a lovely, slender woman with a hooked nose, deathly pale face, lips red as rowan berries, startlingly blue eyes, and long, fair hair. And she will suddenly transform herself into a sow, a mare, a bitch, a vixen, as she has. But that one of the Tolkien trilogy that Jackson did, he had that one of the elf ladies all of a sudden appeared in that guise, and I think that's whether Tolkien wrote her that way or whether Graves did, I don't know, but I recall that. The criticisms of the White Goddess that you were pointing out, he's been criticized. Graves grew up in Wales, and his great-grandfather was a Welsh scholar of Celtic mythos and all, and his great-grandfather rejected Graves' book. He said he wouldn't have anything to do with it. He rejected it completely. So Graves...
Well, he rejected it as scholarship. He rejected it as being... kind of accurate in a purely historical sense. I don't think that he rejected it as poetry.
Yeah. No, you're right. He didn't. I mean, but one of the things, the criticisms of Graves, they're saying, oh, well, no, it really wasn't that way, and they really didn't have they had a tree alphabet, but it wasn't like Graves imagined it, and they didn't have the 4 quarters. They only had 3, and so... What they're doing is they're literally what all these scholars, many of them are doing, is they're picking apart Graves' reconstruction because Graves because of where he has all these cultural diffusionist ideas that he's coming through, he created what he created with the tree alphabet and the calendar and the zodiacal references and everything. He hermeticized the system. He brought it in line with the Hermetic tradition all the way from Alexandria on up. And Fred, of course, resonated with that very, very much because Fred was essentially a Hermetic magician. So the idea of laying it out with our seasons and our calendar and our directions and all of that, and the relation to the Greco-Roman tradition, this made it all very doable and very workable in our context. And so Graves is criticized for doing that. Well, I find that, gosh, I think that's great, because that's what we did with going off of Jesse Weston's idea, and then we took the Russian Ra tablets from Canaan, and we hermeticized them, and we brought them into as if they would have metamorphosized through the Hermetic tradition. So we could have so Baal. In the OTA tradition, Baal becomes almost like he's a Ur king, and he's like kind of like a sun god, whereas actually he wasn't the sun god. They had a sun goddess in Canaan, and they were more oriented toward Venus and the moon, and then one of my correspondents, Steve Posh, has a Canaanite group. This primarily Jewish-oriented Canaanite group in the Midwest, and he told me when he said, "Oh, come on, Pope, they didn't do their seasonals on the solstices and the equinoxes. They did them on their planting times." And I told him, I said, "Steve, I know that, but that was what they did then. Now we took it and we hermeticized it." And so we brought it into the mainstream. We made it work in its own culture, but it reflects the way the magical world works. In other words, and they point out in here that in the criticisms of Graves that 1734 and various witchcraft groups and all, that they're all essentially Western Hermetic, and that isn't the way they really did it. Well, okay, that isn't the way they really did it, but as far as I'm concerned, that's the way they should have done it. What do you think about that?
It occurred to me that probably there are at least a few listeners that, we casually refer to, the tree alphabet, and Agam, and people don't necessarily know what that is. And I thought, if you don't mind, I'll just take a brief moment to read the very short paragraph from the White Goddess that introduces that tree alphabet, if that's all right.
Yeah, go ahead.
He says, "I first found the Beth Louis Neon tree alphabet in Roderick O'Flaherty's Ogygia. He presents it with the Boybel Loth as a genuine relic of Druidism, orally transmitted down the centuries. It is said to have been latterly used for divination only, and consists of 5 vowels and 13 consonants. Each letter is named after the tree or shrub of which it is the initial." And then he starts literally just giving the list of what each one is, and the very first one is birch. And each one has a very short chapter devoted to it that outlines all the qualities and sort of mythological associations with both the birch tree and everything that relates to the birch tree that's sort of goddess-oriented or part of the mythology that leads to the White Goddess. So the birch tree has some, important characteristics, like being the tree of inception. It's the first of the forest trees, other than the mysterious elder tree, to put out new leaves. And so it has, in Scandinavia, its leafing marks the beginning of the agricultural year because farmers use it as a directory for sowing their spring wheat. So each one of the trees or bushes that is associated with one of these letters has very specific characteristics, which can be, the trees and the letters for themselves, for the trees, can be used as divination tools. Like you can put them on, make like tarot-style cards with a few of the associations that seem most pertinent, and then you can use them as a divinatory system. And that's really how they were used for a long time, at least in more recent times. and it's a real fascinating discussion what he has here, and kind of corollary to that. Really interesting work has been done in more recent times with the advent of the Internet by people who are getting really involved in what's called Celtic Reconstructionism, and I was able to read a whole lot more and learn a lot more about the tree alphabet calendar, which is expanded and not called just that, into what's called Ogham, which is this language, which is pretty much the same. It's the Beth Louise, what we call Neon, but which is kind of like their ABC, but it's with these little drawings of like lines on a stick, and then again each one has this series of correspondences. Really interesting book by Aaron Rowan Lowry called Ogham Weaving Word Wisdom. So that's kind of the more modern set of research and scholarship on that whole approach.
Now let me ask you a question about that one, because I haven't read that yet, and I want to. But does she go the way Robert Graves did, and carry the correspondences all the way out to the zodiac, or does she just go short of that?
Each letter has correspondences in three worlds, and so there's the lower world, the middle world, and then sort of the astral travel world. And it's not so much what I would call astronomical / astrological, because she's really there is some, for instance, there's some discussion of Ceres. There's a planet called Ceres, and it's an asteroid, and it's connected with Roman harvest grain, and this is all under the Gort, which is one of the letters for growth. So there is some of that. It's not as involved in that as Graves.
Well, you see, the reason why I mentioned that is because when Graves did this, and when Fred, and one of the reasons why I think Fred was so fascinated by it, because Graves was moving these natural correspondences all the way out to the zodiac. So what you're doing here, what Graves was attempting to do, was to make this a grand scheme. In other words, he was making it a grand scheme. He was making it using the Hermetic proposition that you are the center of the universe, and the universe goes on, all the way out to the constellations, the planets, and everything else.
Right.
So you wrap it all up in one grand scheme, and that. Of course, as you remember, Fred. Good gosh, Fred was a wonderful astrologer. Mm-hmm. He was just, and so he really warmed up to this, and I remember that wonderful. We still have it. At Rivendell, we have that cosmic tuning dial. With the spaces of the moon. Mm-hmm. And Fred just really just ate this up like this was meat for Fred, although he was off and on a vegetarian, but still, this is really, and this is what Graves was trying to do. He was trying to justify the Druids and the Celtic bards as really wise men. Now, one of the reasons why this sort of thing does not appeal to scholars today, or back when even back when Graves was writing about it, why it doesn't appeal to them, is because this is what Guido von List and Lanz Liebenfels tried to do with their Ariosophy, with the runes in Germany. They tried to relate them all the way out to the constellations and to astrology, and to have the runes so they could make the runes universally powerful.
I'm just gonna go ahead. I'm sorry. Finish your.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that idea of coming up with that pagan, that very universal, powerful, magical alphabet that was pagan and not Christian.
Right.
And that, of course, got picked up by Rudolf Sabotendorf in the Thule Society, and you know what happened then. So consequently, anything like this after World War II, any scholar who did something like this, it automatically turned other scholars who were afraid of it. They didn't want to get anywhere near it, and so they went on a sort of. They sort of shrunk within themselves, and they said, let's just study the culture with just what we know about it, and let's don't make any extrapolations,
right.
and let's don't look for anything like this, because look what happened. Look what happened to with these guys in Germany, you know.
Let me mention, if I may, something, because it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Just a few minutes ago, you were speaking about the moon dials that Fred had developed, as part of the temple.
Yeah.
I actually have a real nice picture of that online at our fairfaria.org website. If anybody wants to see what that looked like, it was right there in the middle of the Fairfarian Temple, and it's really beautiful, and I'm glad you still have that. And if someone wants to find it, there's a lot of stuff on the Fairfaria website, so I'll just say where it is. If you go from the home page to the tab called Roots, and then under the articles that are there, all the articles, you'll see Fred Adams and Fairfaria, and then go probably about halfway down the page, and on the right you'll see that beautiful picture of the Fairfaria Temple interior.
Well, that's great. Now, here's what we're going to do. We have, of course, sitting on top of the cosmic tuning dial right now, we have the dodecahedron that Fred and Jim Ordonez spent all that time and effort and everything putting together.
Right.
And that's a platonic solid that represents the whole universe. It's a celestial sphere, but it's in the form of a dodecahedron. And they very carefully did the Milky Way and all the constellations and everything on this thing.
I think Jane Chapin actually put those actual stars on there. She was really instrumental in that. Yeah.
Well, we have this, and we were in the temple today, and we put our Enneosphere, which is up, which we put up our Enneosphere on top of the altar, which of course, both Fred and I both love that Enneosphere. Fred did much more work with it, developing it, than I did, but we both got it from Paul Christian's History and Practice of Magic, which is the French version of the Crater-Rapoa. And so we got that up. But what I want to do is have, now that you mentioned the tuning dial, next time we get a chance, Lauren will photograph the dodecahedron, and we'll put that up, because I want people to see that.
Sure.
We'll send you some copies of it, and you can put it up.
That sounds good.
Yeah.
Relating, because we're here talking about the White Goddess, I just ran across a great quote that he has in there. The White Goddess was the hinge on which the door of the year swung. As ruler of the celestial hinge at the back of the north wind, around which, as Varro explains in his Do Re Rustica, the millstone of the universe revolves.
Yep, and of course, the Roebuck in the Thicket. I don't know whether I'm encroaching on somebody's secrets here, but the Roebuck in the Thicket, which is a chapter in the White Goddess, as I recall, that represents the thicket is the Pleiades, and the Pleiades, the lunar zodiac, and the moon has a zodiac, of course, as we know, and the lunar zodiac springs out of the Pleiades. And this is what he's talking about, or Graves is talking about, when he says that the hinge of the year. And we do this, of course, in our March poll. We have that swing the ladies' silver keys twice around the Pleiades,
Mm-hmm.
So that so much of this is hung on the phases of the moon, and that relates also to the Hermetic proposition, because the phases of the moon, and the mansions of the moon are very, very much a part of the Hermetic tradition. So that's essentially what he's saying is that the moon goddess for the Europeans, all the way from the ancient Greeks on up through the Druids, the moon goddess was the inspiration behind all of this, and yet at the same time, the poetry and all the adventures are the son of the moon goddess, not the moon goddess herself. She just she's in the background, but she's the force.
Excuse for action.
Yeah, right. The power from which it all derives. I think that we ought to mention that the white goddess was quite an inspiration, not just for Fred and Svetlana, but it was also an inspiration for Roy Bauer's 1734 order, which grew up just around about the same time the Gardnerians were getting started over in England, and we're gonna get into depth. We're gonna go into depth on 1734 next week. But and I hope. Well, by the way, Ann Finnan was gonna call in tonight, but she has a writers' meeting, so she couldn't. So she'll. Okay. I think she'll probably call in next week when we get on 1734. I'm sure she's going to want to do that. But
now, can I just ask a question of clarification?
Yeah.
Just moments ago, you were talking about, I was talking about, we were both talking about the goddess as the hinge of the year. You know, to be honest, I thought when they were talking about the celestial hinge at the back of the north wind, I pretty much figured we were talking about Polaris, the North Star. But you're saying that it's from Pleiades. No,
both. You see, behind all of this lies what we have come to call the initiatic code, and the symbolism of this, of all of this symbolism, starts back when the Milky Way and the Pleiades were all lined up with vernal equinox. Sometime around about the time when about 4,000 something or other BC, and or if you take the De Santana and Von Decken version, you can kick it back to 22,000 BC, something like that.
Wow.
Next cycle, yeah. But regardless of that, it's bullseye astrology. The bull comes out. It's when the zodiac is precessed to the point where the vernal equinox line is right on the Milky Way, and the Pleiades are right there, and the lunar zodiac starts, and that goes along the celestial equator, and then the zodiac does its loop. But the polar aspect of this, Graves deals with that, the Great Bear and the polar aspect of it, because the Milky Way is the river of souls, and he also deals with that too. The river of souls, they go on up, and back when they got this started, Capricorn was the gate of the gods, and Cancer was the gate of men. The souls came in, and this is all lies behind this initiatic code, where your soul, Cercidi, in the Celtic mythology, the three castles. The spiral castle and I can't remember exactly what the castle. Yeah, they're right. That relates, according to Graves, that relates to the zodiac. It relates to the polar, the polar sequence, and the Milky Way going up and all of that. But what these critics are saying is, oh no, this is just the three levels of the Celtic. The Celtic universe, it's just like the Nordic thing, Asgard and Asgard and Nephilim and like that. But Graves is making the proposition that there's a celestial analog to this, and I think he's right. I don't think the ancients were stupid, but
they had a lot of time to really think about things, and they were pretty smart.
That's right, they were, and I hate to say this, but so many of these scholars were Marxists, and Marxism has a dogma that everything has to evolve from the simple to the complex, and that applies to human intelligence. And so they really, they don't want to accept, the Marxist academic does not want to accept the idea that ancient man, even prehistoric man, might have been just as smart as we are today.
What
They don't
on
want to
earth
accept
do they
that.
do when they see these incredibly complex and beautiful statues from 12,000 BC?
They
I mean, what do they
denied
do?
them. They denied them for years and years and years, and now, Joe, now that we know they're 12,000 years old, that Ice Age civilization really was there. Now that we know that, they don't want to say anything.
Huh.
They just
They're all
shut
retiring.
up. No, they're
From their
retiring.
years at the other universities.
They're going. They're not saying anything. They're just ignoring the whole thing. They got their heads in their sand like ostriches.
Wow.
And yet we were right, and so I think Robert Graves was righter. Honestly and truly, I think Robert Graves was righter than these people, than his critics say he was. I personally feel that way myself.
Well, I still hold back on this whole, the diffusionist theory. In other words, when I read through his material and I see these constant references to Janus and the Roman god and the Greek, and like trying to say as if somehow the Celtic reality in the British Isles was really kind of dependent on that. I don't like it, because I see that what they had there was so dense and so beautiful and so, magical. They didn't need to have the influence of Rome coming in to enlighten them.
I thoroughly agree with you, and I completely agree with that. And I've said several times with diffusionists, and of course we get a lot of diffusionists in occultism. Everything comes from Atlantis, or
Asgard, or someplace, yeah.
Or the Anunnaki, the fallen angels. We're nothing without the fallen angels,
Right.
Whatever. Well, okay, I think we had fallen angels. Yeah, I think we had an Anunnaki. I think we've been, all that. But we, human beings, are perfectly capable of inventing the flush toilet and the machine gun all by themselves. They don't need help from somebody else, And the Russians claimed they invented the telephone before we did, but they probably, it was just a 100-monkey thing. Telephones were the thing to have, and they invented them about the same time we did.
It seems to be so often the case with inventions. People all over the world spontaneously come up with the same thing at the same time.
Exactly. It's a 100-monkey theory. And it kind of validates our universal mind, but then, we don't have any problem with that, because we think all human minds are connected and at a certain level. So why not? But I do think this. I think that Graves is right now. You may not agree with me, but I think Graves is right to this extent. I think that the ancient Greeks in Homer's time, and even before Homer's time, I think they do have a connection with what went on later on in Central Europe and Northern Europe. I think there is a connection there. And
go on.
Yeah. Well, a mythological, but also, and this is a sort of a cultural connection. In other words, there's been some serious speculation that Beowulf's Geats were originally related to the Achaeans in Greece, to Homer's Achaeans. And you get a lot of speculation. A lot of this comes from German scholars. The Germans are back at it again as far as that's concerned. They will deal with these things. There's a German writer by the name of Saram who will actually deal with this stuff. This is verboten. You're not even supposed to even think about this sort of thing in Western scholarship. But they had migrations. Like the Romans believed that they were descended from the Trojans. Mm-hmm. That the Trojan refugees from Troy founded Rome. There's Virgil put that in one of his patriotic Roman poems. And the British, the Britons, they believed that that Joseph of Arimathea came over there and deposited the Grail at Glastonbury.
This whole discussion reminds me a bit of the one God versus the many gods. It's kind of like a chicken and egg situation.
I know.
And I think they're both valid, and I don't see that as being a contradiction. You
know
what I mean?
No, it's not. But it's also too, and it's true. And Graves ran into this, and that everything Graves had to work with, all the legends and all the old stuff that he had to work with, was all written down by Christian monks,
right.
and they had to insert as much biblical and Christian stuff in it as they could. And Graves, rather than try to just tear it all out and say it had nothing to do with it, he sort of kind of almost went along with them from a poetic point of view. He's got a lot of, in the White Goddess, he's got a lot of biblical references. I mean, there are a lot of, oh yeah, he does.
And the interpretations of the basic poem that he's looking at, deciphering what each riddle is, lots and lots of those references, what he says are the solutions to the riddle, you wouldn't be able to come up with them unless you knew the Bible really well.
That's right. That's right. And that King Jesus book that he did, he used the tree alphabet in the King Jesus book. Jesus was just about an honorary druid, and I mean, so Graves does he makes some real stretches, and I do agree with you. I think he goes too far in some of this, in trying to tie all this together. But then on the other hand, I feel like we shouldn't try to isolate these little groups and just say they didn't know what was going on in the next island.
I think there was a lot of travel going on, and there really always was. And you're gonna find things in America from Egypt. You're going to find things from all over the Mediterranean, throughout the British Isles, and probably throughout Russia while you're at it. I mean, people did travel. I think that's,
of course.
And
they traveled, and here's another thing, wise men and women who people who could read and write and were the repositories of lore. They were an elite that did travel, and they did know what was going on, and they did have books and they could read them. And I would not be at all surprised if that library that the Romans burned in Wales, on island off of Wales, I wouldn't be surprised if there weren't books in ancient Greek in that library.
I actually wasn't aware of that. When did that happen?
I mentioned that right before you came on. One of the reasons why we don't know hardly anything about the Druids, and we really don't, is because the Romans they hated the Druids, and they feared them, and they hated them, and part of their conquest of Western Europe was to destroy the Druids.
I see.
And
the
Druids, unfortunately for the Druids, they had very few books, and they made their adepts had to memorize everything. If you were a Druid priest, you were also a bard. And they did everything in poetry, and they had to memorize everything. Right. And so the few books that they had, which were their source material, their reference material, they took them all to this island as they got pushed back, this island off of Wales. And this was their university or their college or whatever. And they fought to the last. They fought to the last Druid. I mean, the last man. And the Romans killed them all, and they burned everything.
That's right up there with the burnings of the Library of Alexandria by the Christians. I mean, it's just an epic tragedy. It's such a loss to humanity,
Absolutely. So this is what, and as I say, I wouldn't be at all surprised if those books that they had were a lot of them were in ancient Greek. And they probably had Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos and the Almagest and they might have even had Herodotus. Who knows?
Yeah.
I mean, they would have. So there's where I think Graves might have a point. But when he goes to all the rest of the business of trying to put Jehovah in there and everything else, no, I'm going to draw the line at that.
Right.
But anyway, no, this has been really, really fascinating. And next week, listen in, because we'll have Ann on, and we'll do 1734, which of course is sort of a continuation of what we've been talking about tonight.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, and that means
sounds like you're wrapping things up, folks. So I just want to thank you very much for having me on the show.
Well, Joe, it's always my pleasure, and
may I just mention for those out there who might be interested, if they haven't already heard me plug it, that we have an amazing website now for Feraferia with like 60 articles on it. It's deep. There's a lot of material on there, and a lot of great pictures and Fred's art and stuff like that. And we've got a nice Facebook timeline going on Facebook for Feraferia also that shows a lot of good stuff about how Feraferia evolved over the years since the kind of inception of it back in the 50s. So you can find that on Facebook, and you can find it as feraferia.org.
Well, we sure will, and you take care, and best to you and yours, and Corey bless, and we will listen in next week, and we're gonna do right following right along with this theme. We're gonna do the Order in 1734, which was one of the earliest witchcraft traditions to come over here to the United States. So until then, good magic.
Record better audio anywhere with Motive digital microphones from Shure. Easy-to-use options like the MV88 plug directly into your phone or computer and include a free app. Create studio-quality sound for podcasts, music, and videos. Visit Shure.com to learn more.